Long ago, there was a man named Caldy who lived a simple life, herding goats. Little did he know that he would discover something which would impact the world for all history from that point forward. One day, this goat herder whistled for his goats to return, but noticed that they were shaking in an odd manner. Fearing they may have been poisoned, he followed them the next day to where they were grazing. Discovering they had eaten mysterious berries off of a shrub, he decided to try them for himself and gained magical powers. Actually, he found it made him more energetic and lively, not exactly the ancient equivalent of Spider-Man, I know. As for why someone would think eating random berries off of a shrub in the wild was a good idea, we may never know. But looking at the origin of coffee, both in legends and in recorded history, will be the goal of this podcast. And along the way, we will see why caffeine from coffee has become the most consumed drug in the world. I want to welcome you to the complete history of coffee. I'm your host, Ira Zaffer. If you're interested in coffee, history, or just looking for a new entertaining podcast, then this is the show for you. In this series, we will be covering coffee in relation to culture, history, literature, religion, and science. Have you ever wondered where coffee comes from? Or what the difference between espresso and cold brew are? Maybe you're curious about the different roasts of coffee or new ways to brew your coffee. We will cover all this and more in this series. To start, let's see where it all began. The origin of coffee begins in the 9th or 10th century, or approximately 1,000 years ago in the area of Kaffa, to the southwest of Abyssinia, which is known today as Ethiopia, beginning with the aforementioned legend of the goat herder Caldy, who is from this region. For those of us who didn't major in geography, Ethiopia is a country in East Africa, near Yemen, a country which sits at the southernmost tip of the Middle East. Both of these countries will be important moving forward, so hold on to that thought. In a second version of the legend, Christian monks from a monastery in Yemen gathered coffee leaves and berries, unaware of their effect, and made a drink out of them. After drinking it, they gained strength and energy, leading the monks to hail this new invention to be a gift from God, which they used to stay awake during their long prayers. There is even a third version of the legend, which continues from Caldy's story, adding later a monk who saw Caldy and his dancing goats became curious and gathered some of the berries from the same shrub. The monk then crushed the berries into a powder, adding boiling water to it. After tasting the strange infusion, he also had a sudden rush of energy. Following this, the monk shared this new concoction with his monastery. However, the monks felt it was too bitter and threw the rest of the beans into the fire. After a short time, they began to smell the aroma of the roasting beans and so decided to then grind the roasted beans and boil them, creating a concoction of exquisite flavor. Now, before we dive into coffee history any further, I want to take a second and consider certain things like the difference between archaeology and the written record. Now, I'm sure we all understand that the written record is anything which is written down in a book, such as literature, philosophy, but it can also include things like court records or personal journals. Now, on the flip side, archaeology is the study of remains, be it physical remains from animals, plants, structures, or even people. Now, oftentimes what we think of as history is a combination of these two together. Now, the other thing I want to address is the time period of this show. Now, because we're covering the history of coffee, we're only covering within about the last 1,000 years or so. So with that said, I will only be referring to years by numbers, as opposed to following them with CE or AD, CE standing for Common Era. So because the show is taking place within Common Era, assume I am referring to that unless otherwise stated. Getting back to our story, little is known about the origins of coffee, but what we do know is coffee has existed in the Middle East for over 1,000 years. Looking at the written and archaeological record, we know coffee originated from the high mountains of Ethiopia, being taken to Yemen around 523 CE by the army of the Aksumite Kingdom. The Aksumite Kingdom was Ethiopian in origin, conquering the Himyarite Kingdom in what is today Yemen. The coffee they brought with them grew well in the highlands of Yemen, leading to Yemen's future hold on coffee dominance for several centuries. In 575, Yemen was invaded by the Persian Sassanid Empire and subsequently fell to Islamic rule in 628. As the Islamic Empire grew in size, so too did the popularity of coffee. This archaeological version of events does seem to correlate in a way with the three legends, with Kali first discovering coffee in Ethiopia, and then those beans eventually making their way to Yemen. However, through archaeology, we find coffee to have a much longer and more complex history than originally assumed. Whether if it's through a superpowered goat herder or an invading army, coffee seems destined to spread across the globe, even at its earliest point in history. Hope you enjoyed this introductory episode. This series is available anywhere you get your podcast and will be up on YouTube as well in visual format. This podcast is the first in a series called the Complete History Podcast Series, and over time we plan to present various areas of history, and with your help we can make this project into a much larger series. If you would like to support this and future projects, please consider donating to our Patreon by searching for the Complete History Podcast Series, or by finding a link in our social media pages on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at the Complete History Podcast Series. By becoming a Patreon subscriber, you can gain access to members-only episodes and drawings for special prizes, as well as scripts, notes, and other documents from the podcast, as well as exclusive merch. We will begin our next episode by examining coffee's culture and history in the Islamic world. I hope you have already learned new and exciting information about coffee, and be prepared to learn more. As Jonathan Moore stated, studying the history of coffee is a lot like barista training. The more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. There will be many things we will be learning together in this podcast, and I think we will all quickly realize just how much we didn't know about this crazy story that is coffee.